In the scorching heat of August 1885, beneath the unforgiving Arizona sun, a single moment of courage would forever change the destiny of three souls whose paths should never have crossed. Marcus Steele Thompson stood 6 feet 4 inches in his weathered boots, a drifter cowboy whose calloused hands had known nothing but rope burns and regret. He'd spent 15 years running from a past that haunted his dreams, moving from ranch to ranch across the Southwest, never staying long enough for anyone to ask the hard questions about the scars that crisscrossed his knuckles or the hollow look that sometimes flickered behind his steel-gray eyes. But on this day, as thunder clouds gathered over the painted desert and ancient spirits whispered warnings through the wind, Steele Thompson would make a choice that would shatter his spine, break open his guarded heart, and lead him into a world where healing came not from running away, but from standing still long enough to let mercy find you. This is the story of how a broken cowboy discovered that sometimes the heaviest burdens we carry aren't the ones that break our backs, they're the ones that break us open before we jump back in. Tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The August sun hammered down on the Arizona territory like God's own anvil, turning the red dust into a furnace that could bake a man's soul as surely as it cracked the earth beneath his boots. Marcus Thompson guided his paint horse, Ranger, along the narrow canyon trail that wound through the Superstition Mountains, his destination unclear, but his purpose certain: keep moving. Keep ahead of the memories that rode harder than any posse dot at 32. Steele had accumulated more miles than most men saw in a lifetime. His weathered face told stories of Kansas wheat fields and Colorado mining camps, of Texas cattle drives and California gold rushes. But beneath the sun-darkened skin and behind the steel-gray eyes that had earned him his nickname lay secrets that ran deeper than any canyon he'd ever crossed. The leather saddlebags draped across Ranger's hindquarters contained everything Steele owned in the world: a spare shirt patched with different colored thread, a tin cup dented from countless campfires, a well-worn Bible that hadn't been opened in 3 years, and a Colt .45 that had seen more use than he cared to remember. Most importantly, buried beneath his meager possessions, wrapped in an oilcloth that had yellowed with age, lay a letter he'd carried for 7 years, but never found the courage to open. The letter bore the careful handwriting of someone who'd learned to write late in life, addressed simply to Marcus Thompson, wherever you may be. The return address read Millerville, Kansas, a town he'd fled in the middle of a winter night when the weight of what he'd done, or failed to do, became too heavy for his 25-year-old shoulders to bear. Steele pulled Ranger to a halt at a rocky outcropping that offered shade and a panoramic view of the desert valley below. The silence was absolute except for the whisper of wind through ancient stone formations and the distant cry of a red-tailed hawk circling high overhead. This was the kind of country that made a man feel small, where the vastness of creation dwarfed human concerns and reduced complex emotions to their simplest elements: hunger, thirst, survival, and the endless question of whether tomorrow would bring redemption or merely another day of running. He dismounted with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent more years in the saddle than on solid ground, his long legs unfolding from Ranger's back with practiced ease. At 6'4" Steele commanded attention wherever he went, but out here in the wilderness, his imposing frame seemed perfectly proportioned to the landscape's grandeur. His shoulders, broad enough to bear the weight of other men's expectations, now carried only the burden of his own regrets. The pain in his lower back, a constant companion for the past 3 years, flared as he stretched his spine. A reminder of the night in Dodge City when he'd miscalculated during a saloon brawl and taken a chair across his kidney from behind. The injury had healed crooked, leaving him with a permanent ache that worsened during long rides and cold nights. Doc Henderson in Tombstone had warned him that continuing to punish his body with the demands of cowboy life would eventually leave him crippled. But Steele had ignored the advice. Pain was just another passenger on his journey, no more welcome than the memories, but equally persistent. As he watered, Ranger from a natural depression in the rocks that had collected rainwater from the previous night's brief storm, Steele's mind wandered to the conversation that had driven him to leave his last job at the Double Bar Ranch outside Tucson. Charlie Morrison, the foreman, had been a decent man who'd offered Steele something no one had given him in years, a chance to stay, to build something permanent, to stop running from whatever demons drove him across the territory like a man possessed. "You're the best hand I've seen in 20 years, Charlie had said as they sat on the bunkhouse steps sharing a bottle of whiskey under stars, so bright they seemed close enough to pluck from the sky. "Got away with horses that's almost supernatural. And you work harder than any 3 men I know. But you're carrying something heavy, Steele, something that's eating you alive from the inside. Why don't you set that burden down and stay here with us? We're family here, and family looks after its own." The offer had terrified Steele more than any charging bull or midnight stampede ever could. Family meant responsibility, accountability, the possibility of letting people down when they needed you most. He'd tried family once back in Kansas, and the results had been catastrophic. Better to keep moving, to remain a stranger whose departure would cause no more than a momentary inconvenience rather than lasting heartbreak. So he'd left the Double Bar in the pre-dawn darkness, leaving behind 3 months' wages and a note thanking Charlie for his kindness but explaining that some men weren't meant for settling down. It was a lie, of course. Steele Thompson wanted nothing more than to belong somewhere, to have people who cared whether he came home at night, to build something lasting with his hands and heart. But wanting something and deserving it were 2 different things entirely. Now, as he sat in the shade of ancient stone walls that had witnessed countless human dramas over the centuries, Steele pulled the yellowed letter from his saddlebags and turned it over in his hands. 7 years of wondering what news it contained. 7 years of imagining scenarios that ranged from forgiveness to condemnation. The postmark was dated 3 months after he'd fled Kansas in shame, which meant someone had taken the trouble to track his movements despite his attempts to disappear completely. Martha, Morrison, Charlie's daughter, and the closest thing to a sweetheart Steele had ever known, would be 28 now. Old enough to be married with children of her own. Old enough to have moved beyond whatever feelings she might have had for the troubled young man who'd worked her father's farm and stolen her heart with quiet conversations and gentle kisses under the Kansas moon. The letter might contain news of her wedding, or worse, news of a tragedy that his cowardly departure had somehow caused. The weight of possibility pressed down on Steele's shoulders like a physical burden as he studied the envelope's faded surface. Opening it would end the uncertainty, but might also destroy the last vestiges of hope he carried. As long as the letter remained sealed, he could imagine that somewhere in Kansas, someone remembered him with kindness rather than bitterness. Distant rumble of thunder interrupted his brooding, drawing his attention to storm clouds building over the eastern peaks. The Arizona monsoon season could produce violent weather with little warning, transforming dry washes into raging torrents and turning navigable trails into death traps for the unwary. Steele needed to find shelter or risk being caught in the open when the storm struck. He tucked the letter back into his saddlebags without opening it, a decision he'd made countless times over the past 7 years. Perhaps tomorrow he'd find the courage to face whatever truth it contained. But today, the weight of uncertainty felt lighter than the possibility of devastating knowledge. As Steele prepared to remount Ranger and continue his journey toward whatever temporary refuge awaited beyond the next ridge, the sound of distant voices carried on the wind. Human voices in this remote wilderness were unusual enough to warrant investigation, though Steele's first instinct was to avoid contact with other travelers. Solitude had become his closest companion, and he guarded it jealously against intrusion from those who might ask uncomfortable questions about his past or future. But something in the tone of the voices, urgent, Distressed, calling out in what sounded like a mixture of English and another language he couldn't identify suggested people in trouble. Despite his desire for isolation, Steele Thompson had never been able to ignore someone else's suffering. It was both his greatest strength and his most dangerous weakness, the quality that had driven him to acts of heroism and moments of devastating failure in equal measure. The voices were coming from a narrow canyon that branched off the main trail, a shadowy passage between towering walls of red sandstone that the late afternoon sun barely penetrated. Steele hesitated at the canyon's mouth, torn between self-preservation and the moral obligation that had shaped every significant decision of his adult life. He could continue on his planned route, leaving whatever drama was unfolding in the canyon to resolve itself without his involvement. Or he could investigate, risking entanglement in circumstances that might complicate his carefully maintained anonymity. The decision was made for him when a young woman's scream echoed from the canyon's depths, a sound of such pure terror and desperation that it cut through Steele's defenses like a blade through paper. Without conscious thought, he spurred Ranger toward the sound, his heels drumming against the horse's flanks as they plunged into the shadowy passage between the towering stone walls. The canyon floor was littered with boulders and fallen trees, evidence of flash floods and rock slides that made navigation treacherous even in daylight. Steele guided Ranger carefully around obstacles while straining to locate the source of the distress calls, which seemed to echo from multiple directions due to the canyon's acoustic properties. As they rounded a sharp bend in the passage, Steele saw them, a group of 5 people clustered around a massive cottonwood tree that had fallen across the narrow canyon floor. The tree, probably brought down by the previous night's storm, had created a barrier nearly 10 feet high and thick enough to block the passage completely. But it wasn't the obstacle itself that had caused the distress. It was what lay trapped. Beneath the tree's massive trunk, a young Native American woman, probably no more than 20 years old, was pinned from the waist down under the cottonwood's weight. Her long black hair was matted with dirt and blood, and her dark eyes reflected the kind of pain that came from crushed bones and internal injuries. She was conscious but clearly in shock, her breathing shallow and rapid as the 4 men around her argued frantically in a mixture of English and what Steele recognized as Apache. One of the men, elderly with silver hair braided with feathers and wearing traditional clothing that marked him as a person of importance in his community, knelt beside the trapped woman while the others debated options for moving the tree. Their voices carried the desperate edge of people who knew they were running out of time, that every minute of delay increased the likelihood of permanent injury or death. Steele dismounted quickly, his trained eye immediately assessing the situation, with the cold calculation of someone accustomed to emergencies. The tree was massive, probably weighing several thousand pounds, far beyond the capability of 4 men to lift, even working together. The woman was trapped at the trunk's thickest point, where the weight would be greatest and the leverage poorest. Conventional rescue methods would require equipment they didn't possess and time they didn't have. But Steele Thompson had spent 15 years learning that sometimes conventional methods weren't enough, that there were moments when a man had to risk everything on a single desperate gamble. His back already ached from the day's ride, and he knew that attempting to lift such weight would likely cause permanent damage to his already compromised spine. But looking at the young woman's pain-filled eyes and the anguish on her companions' faces, Steele realized that some risks were worth taking regardless of the personal cost. As he approached the group, the elderly Apache man looked up with a mixture of suspicion and desperate hope. Their eyes met across the cultural divide that separated their worlds, and in that moment, Steele Thompson understood that he was about to make a choice that would change everything about who he was and who he might become. The weight of the tree would either break his back or break him open, but either way, there would be no running from what came next. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, Subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The silence that followed Steele's approach was heavy with unspoken tension. 4 pairs of dark eyes turned toward him, assessing this tall stranger whose arrival could mean salvation or additional danger. The elderly Apache man rose slowly from beside the trapped woman, his weathered hands moving with deliberate calm. Despite the urgency of the situation, "You are far from the white man's trails, cowboy," the elder said in accented but clear English. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to leadership, tempered by the desperation of a man watching. "Someone precious suffer. This is Apache land, sacred ground where your kind rarely venture." Steele removed his hat in a gesture of respect, his steel-gray eyes never leaving the trapped woman's face. "Name's Marcus Thompson, sir. I heard someone in distress and came to help. Your granddaughter?" "My daughter," the elder corrected, his voice catching slightly on the words. "Ayana, which means eternal blossom in our tongue. She is everything to our people. A bridge between the old ways and the new world that comes, whether we welcome it or not." The trapped woman, Ayana, stirred at the sound of her name, her pain-glazed eyes focusing briefly on Steele's face. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but the words were in perfect English with only the slightest accent. "Please ... The tree came down so fast. I was gathering sacred herbs for the ceremony when the earth shook from the thunder. I cannot feel my legs." Steele knelt beside her, his experienced eye taking in details that confirmed his worst fears. The massive cottonwood had her pinned at hip level, and the angle suggested possible spinal compression. Her lower body showed no movement, and the pallor of her skin indicated shock and possible internal bleeding. Without immediate medical attention, she would die within hours. "How long has she been trapped?" Steele asked the elder. 2 hours, maybe more. We were returning from the trading post in Globe when we heard her cries. The tree is too heavy for us to move, and..." The elder's voice trailed off as he gestured helplessly at the impossible situation. The other 3 men, 2 younger Apache warriors and what appeared to be a mixed-blood translator, had been attempting to dig under the tree or find leverage points, but their efforts had only succeeded in shifting the trunk slightly, causing Ayana to cry out in increased pain. Steele studied the massive cottonwood with the analytical mind of someone who'd spent years solving problems that seemed impossible. The tree was perhaps 40 feet long and easily 3 feet in diameter at its thickest point, where Ayana was trapped. The root ball had torn loose from soil softened by the previous night's rain, sending the ancient giant crashing across the narrow canyon passage. "We need to lift it straight up," Steele said finally. Rolling it or shifting it sideways could crush her completely, but lifting dead weight like this ... He trailed off, knowing what such an attempt would cost him. Elder, who had introduced himself as Joseph Crowfeather, studied Steele with eyes that seemed to see beyond surface appearances. "You speak as one who knows hard choices, Marcus Thompson. But this tree weighs more than 4 horses. Even a man of your size cannot lift such weight alone." Steele was already moving, stripping off his vest and rolling up his sleeves to expose arms corded with muscle from 15 years of ranch work. Maybe not alone, but with 4 other men positioned at different points along the trunk, we might be able to create enough lift for someone to pull her free. It was a desperate plan, and everyone present knew it. The physics were barely possible, even under ideal conditions, and these were far from ideal. The tree's weight was distributed unevenly, the ground was soft and unstable, and any mistake could result in the trunk crushing Ayana completely. "There is great risk," Joseph Crowfeather said quietly. "If the tree shifts wrong, she dies. If we cannot lift it high enough, she dies. And you ... double quotes." He paused, studying Steele's face. "You carry old pain in your back. I see it in how you move, how you favor your left side. This attempt could break you forever." Steele met the elder's penetrating gaze steadily. Some things are worth the risk. The simple statement hung in the air between them, carrying weight beyond its words. Joseph Crowfeather nodded slowly, recognizing something in Steele that went deeper than mere heroics. This was a man who understood sacrifice, who had carried burdens that left marks on both body and soul. Very well. Tell us how to help. The next 20 minutes were spent in careful preparation. Steele positioned the 4 Apache men at strategic points along the tree's length, explaining how they would need to coordinate their lifting to avoid shifting the weight onto Ayanna. The youngest warrior, who introduced himself as Running Wolf, would be responsible for pulling Ayanna free the moment sufficient clearance was created. When I give the signal, everyone lifts together, Steele instructed, taking his position at the tree's heaviest point, directly over where Ayanna lay trapped. Don't try to be heroes. If you feel the weight shifting wrong, let go immediately. Better to fail safely than succeed catastrophically. As he gripped the rough bark and prepared to attempt the impossible, Steele felt a familiar tightness in his lower back where old injuries had never properly healed. Doc Henderson's warnings echoed in his mind. One more serious strain and you'll be lucky to walk again, let alone ride. But looking down at Ayanna's pain-filled eyes, Steele knew that some choices transcended self-preservation. This young woman represented something he'd lost years ago in Kansas innocence. Hope, the possibility that one person's actions could make a difference in someone else's life. He'd failed to save the people who mattered most to him once before. He wouldn't fail again. On 3, Steele called out, his voice carrying across the canyon. 1.2. The world crystallized into a single moment of perfect clarity. Steele could hear his own heartbeat, feel the rough bark against his palms, sense the gathered tension of 4 other men preparing to attempt the impossible. Somewhere overhead, the red-tailed hawk cried again, its voice carrying across the vast emptiness of the desert like a benediction. 3. Steele Thompson drove upward with every ounce of strength he possessed, his powerful legs straightening like coiled springs as he fought to lift weight that should have been impossible for any human being to move. The other men strained alongside him, their combined effort focused on the single goal of creating enough space for Running Wolf to pull Ayanna to safety. For a moment that stretched into eternity, nothing happened. The tree remained immovable, an ancient giant that had weathered countless storms and would not be denied its final resting place. Steele's back muscles screamed in protest as he poured everything he had into the lift, feeling something deep in his spine begin to separate under the tremendous pressure. Then, incredibly, the tree began to rise, inch by agonizing inch. The massive trunk lifted away from Ayanna's trapped body. The other men grunted with effort, their faces contorted with strain as they fought to maintain their grip on the shifting weight. Steele felt something important tear loose in his back, a sensation like rope snapping under too much tension. But he held on, driving upward with a determination born of desperation and something deeper, a need to prove that he could save someone. When it mattered most. Now. Steele shouted through gritted teeth. Get her out now. Running Wolf didn't hesitate. With the fluid grace of his warrior training, he slipped under the partially lifted trunk and grasped Ayanna around the shoulders, pulling her free just as Steele's strength began to fail. The tree crashed back to earth with a thunder that echoed off the canyon walls, sending up a cloud of dust and debris that momentarily obscured everything. When the dust settled, Ayanna lay safely in her father's arms while Steele Thompson knelt in the dirt, his face gray with pain and his entire body shaking from the aftermath of impossible exertion. He'd succeeded in saving her, but the cost was immediately apparent to everyone present. Marcus, Joseph Crowfeather said softly, kneeling beside the injured cowboy. You have given much to save my daughter. How badly are you hurt? Steele tried to stand and immediately collapsed, his legs refusing to support his weight. The pain in his back was unlike anything he'd ever experienced, not the sharp agony of a fresh injury, but something deeper and more permanent. He could feel the wrongness in his spine, the way his body no longer responded properly to his commands. "Can't feel my legs properly," Steele admitted, his voice tight with controlled panic. "Something's torn loose in there, torn loose bad." The irony was not lost on him. In saving Ayanna from being paralyzed by the tree, he had likely paralyzed himself. But looking at the young woman breathing freely in her father's arms, Steele felt no regret. Some sacrifices were worth making, regardless of the personal cost. Joseph Crowfeather's weathered hands examined Steele's back with surprising gentleness, his fingers probing along the spine with the knowledge of someone experienced in treating injuries. His expression grew increasingly grave as he worked. "The damage is serious," the elder finally announced. "But you are not broken beyond healing, though the path back to wholeness will be long and difficult. My people have knowledge of such things, ways of mending what seems beyond repair." Steele managed a weak smile despite his pain. "Reckon I won't be riding anytime soon." "No," Joseph agreed. "But perhaps it is time you stopped running and learned to heal, both in body and spirit, as Running Wolf and the other warriors fashioned." A travois to transport both Ayanna and Steele, the elder knelt beside the injured cowboy once more. "You have saved my daughter's life at great cost to yourself. By Apache law and tradition, this creates a bond between us that cannot be broken. You are now family, Marcus Thompson, whether you understand what that means or not." Steele closed his eyes, feeling the weight of those words settle into his consciousness. Family, the thing he'd spent 15 years running from, earned through a single moment of sacrifice and pain. Perhaps Doc Henderson had been right about his back being unable to withstand more punishment. But perhaps there were some things more important than physical wholeness. As the improvised rescue party prepared to leave the canyon, carrying both the saved and the savior toward an uncertain future, Steele Thompson realized that his days of running were over. For better or worse, he was about to discover what it meant to stay in one place long enough to heal, or to finally face the consequences of everything he'd been running from. The Apache village materialized from the desert landscape like a mirage, becoming real. Hidden in a natural amphitheater carved between towering red cliffs, the settlement of perhaps 200 souls existed in harmony with the harsh beauty of the Arizona territory. Traditional wickiups constructed of willow frames and animal hide dotted the valley floor, interspersed with more permanent adobe structures that spoke of a people adapting to changing times while maintaining their ancient ways. Steele Thompson lay on the travois, his consciousness drifting in and out as the makeshift stretcher bounced over rocky terrain. The pain in his back had evolved from sharp agony to a deep, persistent ache that seemed to pulse with his heartbeat. More troubling was the gradual loss of sensation in his lower extremities, a numbness that suggested nerve damage beyond simple muscle strain. As their procession entered the village, Steele became aware of eyes watching from doorways and around cooking fires. Children pointed at the unusual sight of a white cowboy being transported alongside the shaman's daughter, their whispered conversations in Apache, creating a susurrus of curiosity and concern that followed the group's progress through the settlement. "The white man saved Ayanna," Running Wolf announced to the gathering crowd, his voice carrying pride and respect. "He lifted the great tree, though it broke his back. Joseph Crowfeather has declared him family." The reaction was immediate and complex. Some faces showed gratitude and welcome, recognizing the debt owed to someone who had risked everything for one of their own. Others displayed skepticism or outright hostility, the look of people who had learned through bitter experience that white men brought trouble more often than salvation. An elderly Apache woman emerged from the largest wickiup, her silver hair braided with turquoise beads, and her bearing radiating authority that commanded immediate respect. Even in his pain-hazed state, Steele recognized someone of tremendous importance in the community hierarchy. "Grandmother," Joseph Crowfeather said formally, dismounting from his horse and approaching the woman with obvious reverence. "I present Marcus Thompson, the cowboy who saved Ayanna's life. He carries injury from his sacrifice and requires the healing ways." The woman whom Steele would later learn was called Elena Many Horses. Joseph's mother and the village's most skilled medicine woman studied the injured cowboy with eyes that seemed to penetrate beyond physical appearance to examine his very soul. Her weathered face revealed nothing of her thoughts as she circled the travois, occasionally reaching out to touch Steele's forehead or pulse points with fingers that moved like bird wings. "This one carries old wounds," she said finally, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Not just in his back, but in his spirit. He has been running from great pain for many seasons, and now the Creator has forced him to stop and face what he fears most." Steele tried to speak, to explain that he needed to get back to his horse and continue his journey, but Elena Many Horses silenced him with a gentle but firm touch to his lips. "Rest now, broken cowboy. Your talking days will come later, when your body has remembered how to be whole. For now, you must learn to trust in ways that white men rarely understand." The next hours passed in a blur of movement and unfamiliar sensations. Steele found himself transported into Elena's wickiup, a surprisingly spacious dwelling that served as both home and healing sanctuary. The interior was dim and cool, filled with bundles of dried herbs hanging from the willow frame and shelves lined with pottery vessels containing mysterious preparations. Running Wolf and another warrior lifted Steele from the travois onto a bed of soft furs and woven blankets that had been prepared near the central fire pit. The movement sent lightning bolts of pain through his damaged spine, causing him to cry out involuntarily before clenching his teeth against further sounds of weakness. "Pain is information," Elena said matter-of-factly as she began removing Steele's boots and examining his injuries. "It tells us what is broken and guides us toward what must be healed. A man who fights pain fights his own body's wisdom." Ayanna was brought in moments later, her own injuries requiring Elena's attention. A young woman had regained some color in her cheeks, and preliminary examination suggested no permanent damage to her spine or internal organs. She would be sore and weak for several days, but she would walk again, thanks to Steele's intervention. "Father says you are family now," Ayanna said softly as Elena worked over both patients with practiced efficiency. "Do you understand what that means to our people?" Steele managed a weak smile despite his discomfort. "Can't say I do, miss. Never had much luck with families." "It means you belong here," Ayanna explained, her dark eyes serious. "Not as a guest or visitor, but as one of us. Our joys become your joys, our sorrows your sorrows. You have responsibilities to the tribe, and the tribe has responsibilities to you. It is not a bond that can be broken by distance or time." The concept was foreign to Steele's experience. His own family had dissolved in tragedy and recrimination, leaving him convinced that emotional attachments led inevitably to pain and disappointment. Yet something in Ayanna's earnest explanation stirred a longing he'd spent years suppressing, the desire to belong somewhere, to be valued not for what he could produce or accomplish, but simply for who he was. Elena's treatment began with a ceremony that combined practical medicine with spiritual healing. She burned sage and sweetgrass while chanting in Apache, the smoke filling the wickiup with aromatic clouds that seemed to carry Steele's pain away on invisible currents. Her hands moved over his injured back with surprising strength, probing and manipulating damaged tissue while murmuring prayers to spirits Steele couldn't see but somehow felt present in the shadowy interior. "Your back has been broken before," Elena observed as she worked. "Years ago, poorly healed. This new injury has torn apart the weak places where old damage never properly mended. Steele closed his eyes, remembering the chair that had caught him across the kidneys in Dodge City. He'd been defending a Chinese laundryman from drunken cowboys who thought terrorizing immigrants was good sport. The fight had ended with the troublemakers. Unconscious, and Steele doubled over in agony, but he'd ridden out the next morning rather than seek proper medical attention. White man's medicine focuses on symptoms, Elena continued, her hands never ceasing their methodical work. Apache healing addresses the whole person, body, mind, and spirit. You cannot mend a broken back without also mending the broken places. In the heart. As if summoned by her words, Joseph Crow Feather entered the wickiup carrying Steele's saddlebags and personal effects. He moved with the quiet dignity of someone performing a sacred duty, setting the bags down near Steele's bedside. Before settling cross-legged beside the fire, "Your horse is well cared for," Joseph said, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "A beautiful animal with strong spirit. He misses his rider but understands that healing takes time." Steele felt a pang of gratitude for these people who thought to care for Ranger when he couldn't. "Thank you. He's about the only family I've had for a long time." "Not anymore," Joseph replied simply. "Now you have many family, whether you are ready for such responsibility or not." The shaman reached into one of Steele's saddlebags and withdrew the yellowed letter that had traveled thousands of miles without being opened. He held it up to the firelight, studying the faded postmark and carefully written address. "This carries great weight," Joseph observed. "Not the paper, but the fear of what the paper contains. Such fear can poison a man's spirit more surely than any rattlesnake's bite." Steele tried to reach for the letter, but his arms wouldn't respond properly to his commands. The paralysis was spreading, creeping upward from his damaged spine like ice forming on a winter pond. Panic fluttered in his chest as he realized the full extent of his injury. The letter, "It's from Kansas, from people I let down a long time ago. I'm not ready to know what it says." Elena paused in her ministrations, exchanging a meaningful glance with her son. "In our tradition, secrets are wounds that fester if left unattended. They poison the blood and weaken the spirit until even the strongest warrior falls to enemies he could have easily defeated." She resumed her healing work, but her words carried the weight of absolute conviction. "You will never walk again, Marcus Thompson, until you stop running from the truth of who you are and what you have done. The body follows the spirit's lead. If the spirit is crippled by guilt and fear, the body will reflect that brokenness." The diagnosis was delivered without cruelty but with the unflinching honesty of someone who dealt daily with life and death. Steele felt tears prick his eyes, not from physical pain, but from the recognition that his injury might be more than just mechanical damage to bones and nerves. "I killed someone," he whispered, the confession torn from his lips by Elena's healing touch, back in Kansas. A boy, really, couldn't have been more than 17. He was trying to rob the bank where Martha worked. I could have stopped him without killing, could have wounded him or talked him down. But I was angry about something else, angry at the world, and I—" Steele's voice broke as 7 years of suppressed guilt poured out like water from a burst. "Damn, the boy had a sister, a little girl who depended on him. When I killed him, I killed her hope too. Martha tried to tell me it wasn't my fault, that I'd saved lives by stopping the robbery. But I saw the truth in her eyes. I'd become something she couldn't love anymore." Joseph Crow Feather listened without judgment, his weathered face reflecting the wisdom of someone who understood that all men carried darkness alongside their light. When Steele finished his confession, the shaman reached for the yellowed letter once more. "Perhaps it is time to learn whether your fears are heavier than reality," Joseph suggested gently. "Truth may be painful, but it cannot poison you the way uncertainty can." Steele closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 7 years accumulated, dread pressing down on his chest like another fallen tree. But surrounded by these strangers who had declared him family, breathing air thick with healing smoke and sage, he found a courage he'd thought permanently lost. "Read it," he whispered. I can't hold it properly anyway, but I need to know." Joseph Crowfeather opened the envelope with ceremonial care, unfolding pages that crackled with age. His eyes moved across the handwritten lines while Steele held his breath, preparing for news that would either free him or destroy him completely. When Joseph began to read, his voice carried the gravity of sacred ritual, transforming Martha Morrison's words into something approaching prayer in the firelit sanctuary of Elena's healing wickiup. Joseph Crowfeather's voice filled the smoky interior of the wickiup as he began to read, each word falling like stones into the still pool of Steele's consciousness. The shaman's weathered fingers held the yellowed pages with reverence, understanding that some words carried the power to heal or destroy the soul that received them. "My dearest Marcus," Joseph read, his English careful and deliberate. "I pray this letter finds you well, wherever your travels have taken you. I know you left believing yourself unworthy of forgiveness, but I write to tell you that the burden you carry is not yours alone to bear." Steele's breath caught in his throat. The voice was unmistakably Martha's, filtered through Joseph's careful pronunciation but retaining the gentle warmth that had once been the brightest light in Steele's world. Elena Many Horses paused in her healing work, sensing the profound importance of this moment for her patient's recovery. "The boy you killed, Tommy Sullivan, was not the innocent victim you believe him to be," Joseph continued, his voice growing stronger as he sensed Steele's desperate need to hear every word. "After you left, Sheriff Williams investigated more thoroughly. Tommy had robbed 3 other banks across Kansas, killing 2 clerks and a customer in Abilene just the week before. He wasn't a desperate boy driven to crime by circumstance, Marcus. He was a killer who would have murdered me and everyone else in that bank if you hadn't stopped him." The words hit Steele like physical blows, each revelation reshaping 7 years of carefully constructed guilt. He had spent thousands of miles and countless sleepless nights believing himself a murderer, carrying the weight of an innocent boy's death like a stone in his chest. Now Martha's words were suggesting that his actions had prevented multiple murders rather than causing a single tragic one. "His sister Sarah, the little girl you worried about, was taken in by my Aunt Rebecca in Lawrence," Joseph read on. "She's grown into a fine young woman, studying to be a teacher. When she learned the truth about her brother's crimes, she asked me to tell you that she understands why you did what you had to do. She said she's grateful that Tommy's victims had someone brave enough to stop him before he hurt more innocent people." Elena resumed her work on Steele's back, her skilled hands probing the damaged tissue, while her grandson's voice continued to unravel the knots of guilt that had bound Steele's spirit for so long. The medicine woman could feel tension leaving her patient's body as each word released. Another coil of self-imposed suffering. "I know you left because you thought I could never love a man who had taken a life," Joseph continued, his voice gentling for the more personal portions of Martha's letter. "But Marcus, what I saw that day in the bank wasn't a killer, it was a protector. A man who risked his own soul to save the lives of people he barely knew. That's not something to run from. That's something to be proud of." Ayanna, who had been resting quietly on her own bed of furs, spoke softly from across the wickiup. "Love that runs away from hard truths was never real love to begin with. This woman writes with the voice of one who sees clearly, even when seeing brings pain." Steele closed his eyes, feeling tears track down his cheeks for the first time in years. The weight he'd carried, the crushing certainty that he was a killer who destroyed an innocent life, was dissolving like morning mist before the desert sun. But with relief came a new kind of pain, the recognition of how much he'd lost by running away from the truth. "There's more you need to know," Joseph read, turning to the letter's second page. "The bank robbery wasn't random, Marcus. Tommy Sullivan was working with Frank Davidson, the man who'd been courting me before you came to town. Frank had gambling debts to dangerous men in Kansas City, and he'd planned to steal enough money to pay them off. When you started working for Father and I, when I fell in love with you, instead of accepting Frank's proposal, he grew desperate enough to hire Tommy and his gang to rob the bank while making it look like outsiders were responsible. The revelation sent a chill through the wiki-up that had nothing to do with the desert's evening coolness. Steele had never known about Frank Davidson's involvement, had never suspected that the bank robbery was anything more than random criminal opportunism. Sheriff Williams arrested Frank 2 days after you left, Joseph continued. He confessed to everything when faced with testimony from Tommy's surviving gang members. Frank was the one who told Tommy which day the bank would have the most cash, which employees would be working, and how to get away clean. If you hadn't been there, if you hadn't stopped Tommy, Frank's plan would have succeeded, and he would have disappeared with enough money to start over somewhere else, leaving a trail of bodies behind. Elena's hands stilled on Steele's back as she absorbed the implications of Martha's words. This woman speaks of great betrayal, the medicine woman observed. A suitor who would arrange murder to win his beloved's hand shows the darkness that lives in men who mistake possession for love. Frank is serving 20 years in the territorial prison, Joseph read. But more importantly, his confession cleared your name completely. You weren't a murderer, Marcus. You were the only person standing between innocent people and a carefully planned massacre. The territorial marshal has issued a statement declaring your actions completely justified. There are no charges against you, no warrants, no legal reason you couldn't come home if you chose to. Steele felt his world reshaping itself around this new understanding. For 7 years he'd believed himself a fugitive from justice as well as a killer. The fear of arrest had driven him to avoid towns and sheriffs, to live on the margins of society where questions weren't asked and names weren't checked against wanted posters. Now Martha was telling him that he'd been free all along, free to return, free to build a life, free to stop running from shadows that existed only in his own tortured imagination. The letter continues for several more pages, Joseph said, folding the papers carefully. But perhaps that is enough truth for one day. Your body needs rest to process what your spirit has learned. No, Steele said, his voice stronger than it had been since the accident. I need to hear it all. Every word. I've run from this truth for 7 years. I won't run from it anymore. Joseph nodded with approval, recognizing the courage required to face painful truths after so many years of avoidance. He unfolded the pages once more, settling himself more comfortably beside the fire as he prepared to read the letter's conclusion. I won't lie to you, Marcus, Joseph continued. Your leaving broke my heart in ways I'm still learning to heal from. But I understand why you ran, and I don't blame you for believing the worst about yourself. You've always carried the pain of others as if it were your own. It's part of what made me love you so deeply. Ayanna stirred on her bed of furs, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight as she listened to this story of love tested by misunderstanding and separation. This woman waited for you, she observed quietly. Even when she didn't know if you would ever return, she kept faith with the man she loved. I'm 30 now, Joseph read on, and Father often asks when I plan to marry and give him grandchildren. The truth is, I'm still waiting for a cowboy who disappeared into the night because he thought himself unworthy of love. I know you may never read this letter, may never learn that the guilt you carry is built on incomplete understanding. But I had to try to reach you, had to hope that someday you'd find the courage to face whatever truth this message contains. Elena resumed her healing work, her weathered hands moving with renewed purpose as she felt the spiritual knots and steels back beginning to loosen. Physical healing often followed emotional release, and she could sense her patient's body beginning to remember how to be whole. If this letter finds you, Marcus Thompson, know that you are loved. Know that you are forgiven. Know that there's a place here for you whenever you're ready to stop running and start living again. The ranch's prospering father could use another good hand, especially one who knows horses the way you do. More than that, I could use the chance to love you properly this time, without the shadows of misunderstanding between us." Joseph paused, studying Steele's face in the firelight. The cowboy's eyes were closed, but tears continued to track down his weathered cheeks as 7 years of carefully constructed guilt crumbled away, like a dam breached by floodwaters. "I close this letter with hope rather than certainty, Joseph. Read, nearing the end of Martha's message. Hope that you're alive and well wherever your travels have taken you. Hope that you've found peace with yourself and the choices you made. And hope that someday, somehow, you'll find your way back to the people who love you exactly as you are, scars, regrets, and all." The wickiup fell silent except for the crackle of burning wood and the soft whisper of Elena's healing chants. Steele lay motionless on his bed of furs, processing revelations that transformed his entire understanding of the past 7 years. The guilt that had driven him across the American West, the fear that had kept him moving from place to place, the certainty that he was unworthy of love or redemption, all of it built on incomplete information and his own willingness to believe the worst about himself. "With all my love and endless faith in the good man I knew you to be, Martha Morrison," Joseph concluded, folding the letter with ceremonial care. "P.S. I've enclosed money for travel expenses, hoping against hope that you'll use it to come home instead of running further away from the truth." Steele opened his eyes, meeting Joseph Crowfeather's steady gaze across the dying fire. "She waited," he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. "All these years, she waited." "Good women often do," Elena observed, her hands still working to heal the physical damage that mirrored her patient's spiritual wounds. "They see the man he could become, not just the broken pieces he shows the world." "But it's too late now," Steele said, the weight of lost years settling over him like a burial shroud. 7 years, Joseph. I threw away 7 years of happiness because I was too much of a coward to face the truth. And now I'm broken in ways that can't be fixed. Even if I could go back, what would I tell her? That I chose guilt over trust, that I valued my own misery more than her love? Ayanna spoke from her bed across the wickiup, her young voice carrying wisdom beyond her years. "Among our people, we believe that the Creator never closes one path without opening another. Your old life may be lost, but that doesn't mean your new life has to be empty. Perhaps the question isn't whether you can reclaim what you lost, but whether you're brave enough to build something new with the truth you've finally found." Alina Many Horses smiled at her granddaughter's words, recognizing the healing wisdom that sometimes spoke through the youngest voices. "The girl speaks truth, broken cowboy. Your back can be healed, your spirit can be mended, but only if you choose healing over the familiar comfort of old pain." Steele closed his eyes again, feeling the first stirrings of something he'd almost forgotten: hope. Not for a return to his former life, but for the possibility that his future might hold more than endless running from a past built on misunderstanding. The letter had freed him from 7 years of guilt, but now he faced a different kind of challenge, learning to live without the burden that had defined him for so long. In the smoky warmth of Elena's healing wickiup, surrounded by strangers who'd declared him family, Steele Thompson began the hardest journey of his life, the journey from self-hatred to self-forgiveness. From isolation to belonging, from running away to standing still long enough to heal. 3 weeks into his recovery, Steele Thompson experienced his first moment of genuine hope when he wiggled his left big toe. The movement was barely perceptible, lasting only a few seconds, but Alina Many Horses received the news as if he'd announced he could suddenly fly. "The spirits are stirring," she declared, her weathered hands examining Steele's feet with renewed intensity. "Your body remembers what it means to be whole. Now we must teach your mind to remember as well." The Apache village had settled into the rhythm of autumn, with the fierce heat of summer giving way to cooler days that made outdoor work pleasant rather than punishing. Steele had become an accepted fixture in Elena's wickiup, his presence no longer drawing curious stares from visiting villagers. Children would peek shyly around the entrance flap, giggling when he attempted to speak Apache words that Ayanna patiently taught him during her own convalescence. Ayanna had recovered completely from her ordeal under the fallen tree, showing no lasting effects from her injuries. But rather than resuming her normal activities, she had appointed herself Steele's primary teacher in Apache ways, spending hours each day helping him understand the cultural complexities of his adoptive family. Among our people, healing is not just about fixing what is broken, she explained as they sat outside Elena's wickiup, watching the sunset paint the desert cliffs in shades of gold and crimson. It is about becoming stronger in the broken places, like pottery that is mended with gold thread. The cracks become part of the beauty. Steele flexed his fingers, testing the gradual return of sensation that Elena's treatments were producing. In the white world, broken things get thrown away or hidden out of sight. We don't much like being reminded that things can break. That is why white men break so easily, Ayanna observed with the frank honesty he'd come to appreciate. You never learn to bend because you're afraid of breaking. But Apache children learn early that the reed that bends in the storm outlasts the oak that stands rigid until it snaps. These philosophical discussions had become a crucial part of Steele's healing process. Elena's physical treatments, a combination of herbal medicines, manipulation therapy, and spiritual ceremonies, were gradually restoring function to his damaged spine. But the deeper healing required understanding concepts that had no equivalent in the cowboy culture that had shaped him. Joseph Crowfeather visited daily, bringing news from the outside world that filtered into the hidden village through Apache scouts and trading contacts. The information was rarely encouraging. Tensions between white settlers and Apache bands throughout the territory were escalating, fueled by government policies that seemed designed to provoke conflict rather than promote peace. General Miles has issued new orders restricting Apache movement, Joseph reported during one of his evening visits. Any band found more than 10 miles from their designated reservation will be considered hostile and subject to military action. Steele frowned, his understanding of Apache geography still incomplete, but sufficient to recognize the implications. This village is at least 50 miles from the nearest reservation. Does that make you all outlaws? It makes us free, Joseph replied with quiet dignity. But freedom carries risks that our children will pay for if we are discovered. The conversation highlighted Steele's growing awareness of his precarious position within the community. His presence, if discovered by military patrols or hostile settlers, could bring catastrophic attention to people who had risked everything to save his life. The knowledge weighed heavily on his conscience, adding another layer of complexity to his recovery process. I should leave as soon as I can travel, Steele said, voicing the concern that had been troubling him for days. I'm putting everyone here in danger just by existing. Elena, many horses who had been preparing evening medicines nearby, looked up sharply at his words. You think like a white man still, believing that problems are solved by running away. But you are Apache family now, and Apache families protect each other instead of abandoning each other when times become difficult. The rebuke was gentle but firm, delivered with the authority of someone whose wisdom had guided the village through countless crises. Steele was beginning to understand that among the Apache, individual concerns were always secondary to community welfare, but that community welfare included caring for every member, regardless of the personal cost. Running Wolf, the young warrior who had pulled Ayanna from beneath the fallen tree, had become an unlikely friend during Steele's convalescence. Despite the language barrier and cultural differences, the two men had discovered a shared appreciation for horses and a similar, dry sense of humor that transcended their different backgrounds. The white man thinks he is a burden, Running Wolf told Joseph in English deliberately slow enough for Steele to follow. But he does not understand that teaching healing is also healing. Elena grows stronger when she has someone to heal. Ayana grows wiser when she has someone to teach. Even the children learn courage by seeing how a broken man learns to stand. Again, the observation was typically Apache in its recognition of interconnection, the idea that individual healing contributed to community strength rather than draining community resources. Steele was slowly beginning to grasp this fundamental difference between white and Apache worldviews, though the concept still felt foreign to his deeply ingrained sense of self-reliance. As his physical condition improved, Steele began contributing to village life in ways that his limitations allowed. His knowledge of horses proved valuable in training younger riders, and his experience with firearms helped improve the village's defensive capabilities. Most surprisingly, his years of solitary travel had given him an encyclopedic knowledge of the territory's geography that proved useful for planning trade routes and avoiding military patrols. "You see the land differently than we do," Joseph observed during one of their map-making sessions. "Apache eyes see water sources, game trails, sacred places. Your eyes see distances, connections, strategic advantages. Together, we see more completely." The collaboration represented a deeper truth about Steele's integration into Apache life. Rather than abandoning his white identity, he was learning to combine the useful aspects of his background with Apache wisdom, creating something new that benefited everyone involved. But the most significant development in Steele's recovery came through an unexpected source: his correspondence with Martha Morrison. Joseph had helped him compose a careful letter explaining his circumstances without revealing the location or nature of his Apache family. Martha's response, delivered through a complex network of trading contacts, had arrived within 2 weeks. "My dearest Marcus," Steele read aloud to his assembled Apache family, his voice steady despite the emotional weight of Martha's words. "Your letter filled my heart with more joy than I've known in 7 years. To learn that you're alive, that you're healing, that you've found people who value you as you deserve to be valued, these are answers to prayers. I'd begun to think we're hopeless." Ayana listened with particular interest, having appointed herself the guardian of Steele's emotional recovery alongside Elena's management of his physical healing. "This woman writes with great strength," she observed. "She does not beg or demand. She simply offers what she has to give." "I understand why you cannot return immediately," Steele continued reading. "The debts you describe not financial debts, but debts of honor and gratitude. These are obligations that good men do not abandon lightly. I have waited 7 years, Marcus. I can wait longer if necessary, knowing that you are safe and growing stronger." The letter went on to describe changes in Kansas, updates on mutual friends, and careful expressions of continued love that made no demands, but left no doubt about Martha's feelings. Most importantly, she had included recent photographs daguerreotypes that showed a mature woman whose beauty had deepened rather than faded with the passage of time. Elena studied the photographs with the analytical eye of someone reading character and facial features. "Strong bones," she pronounced finally. "This one would bear healthy children and survive hard winters. She has the look of a woman who chooses her path rather than accepting whatever fate offers." The assessment, delivered with Elena's characteristic bluntness, prompted laughter from the assembled family, but also highlighted the growing complexity of Steele's situation. His Apache family clearly expected him to remain permanently, integrating fully into their community and perhaps marrying within the tribe. But his heart still belonged to a woman 2,000 miles away, who had waited 7 years for his return. The dilemma came to a head during the October new moon, when Elena announced that Steele's physical recovery had progressed sufficiently to attempt the final healing ceremony. The ritual, she explained, would either complete his healing or reveal that his injuries were beyond the reach of Apache medicine. Your body has remembered most of what it forgot, Elena said as she prepared the sacred materials for the ceremony. But the deepest healing requires a choice that only you can make. You must decide whether you wish to be Apache completely, with all the obligations and connections that brings, or whether you wish to be healed enough to resume your white man's life. The choice was more complex than it initially appeared. Complete healing would require a spiritual commitment to Apache ways that might make returning to white society impossible. Partial healing would allow him to resume his former life, but would leave him forever marked by his experiences in the hidden village. Joseph Crow Feather sat beside Steele as they prepared for the ceremony, his weathered face reflecting years of difficult decisions. "There is no wrong choice, my son," the shaman said gently. "But there are consequences to every choice that must be accepted with full understanding." As the sun set over the desert mountains and the village prepared for the most important ceremony of Steele Thompson's life, he found himself facing the same fundamental question that had driven him across the American West for 7 years. Who was he meant to be, and where was he meant to belong? The answer would determine not just the success of his physical healing, but the entire trajectory of his future life. In the flickering light of ceremonial fires, surrounded by people who had declared him family despite every cultural barrier, between them, Steele Thompson prepared to make the most important decision of his 32 years. The healing moon rose over the desert, its silver light illuminating a man poised between two worlds, two loves, and two completely different visions of what his life could become. Whatever choice he made in the sacred circle would be irrevocable, binding him to a path that would define the rest of his days. The ceremony was about to begin, and Steele Thompson was finally ready to stop running from his destiny, whatever form that destiny might take. The ceremonial fire cast dancing shadows across the assembled faces as Elena Many Horses began the ancient ritual that would determine Steele Thompson's future. The entire village had gathered in a natural amphitheater formed by towering red rocks, their forms creating a sacred circle that had been used for healing ceremonies for countless generations. Steele lay on a bed of sacred sage and sweetgrass. At the circle's center, his shirt removed to expose the intricate pattern of scars that mapped his journey from Kansas cowboy to broken healer. Elena had painted symbols on his chest and back using clay mixed with herbs and his own blood, markings that told the story of his spiritual transformation in a language older than written words. "The ceremony you are about to witness, Joseph," Crow Feather announced to the gathered villagers, his voice carrying the authority of generations of shamanic tradition, "will call upon the deepest spirits of healing to mend what has been broken. But healing comes with a price that must be paid willingly, with full understanding of what is gained and what is lost." Ayana sat in the front row of observers, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight as she watched the man who had saved her life prepare to make the choice that would define his destiny. Beside her, Running Wolf and the other warriors maintained the solemn dignity appropriate to such moments, while children peered around their parents with the wide-eyed fascination that sacred ceremonies always inspired. Elena began chanting in the ancient tongue, her voice weaving patterns of sound that seemed to resonate with the very stones surrounding them. She moved around Steele's prone form with rhythmic steps that had been passed down through generations of medicine women, each gesture precisely calibrated to call forth the healing spirits that dwelt in this sacred place. As the chanting intensified, Steele felt something shifting deep within his damaged spine, not physical sensation, but something more fundamental. It was as if his bones and nerves were remembering their original purpose, awakening from the traumatic sleep that had held them captive since the moment he lifted the fallen tree. "Marcus Thompson," Elena's voice rose above the chanting, addressing him directly for the first time since the ceremony began. "You stand at the crossroads between two paths. One leads to complete healing, but requires you to surrender your white identity and become Apache in body, mind, and spirit. The other allows you to return to your former life, but but you will carry the marks of this experience forever, never fully belonging to either world. The choice hung in the air like smoke from the sacred fire, heavy with implications that went far beyond personal preference. Steele understood that this was not simply about medical treatment. It was about fundamental identity, about choosing which version of himself he wanted to become. If you choose the Apache path, Alina continued, her weathered hands hovering over his damaged spine, you will be reborn into our tribe completely. Your white name will be replaced with an Apache name that reflects your true nature. Your memories of the outside world will remain, but they will no longer define you. You will take an Apache wife, raise Apache children, and defend our people with your life when the time comes. The vision of that life unfolded in Steele's mind with startling clarity. He saw himself standing beside Running Wolf in defense of the village, his spine straight and strong, his identity fully integrated into the community that had saved him. He saw children who might call him father, a wife who would share his bed and his dreams, a place in the world where he belonged completely and without question. But as the vision solidified, another image forced itself into his consciousness. Martha Morrison standing on the porch of her father's farmhouse, her eyes scanning the horizon for a rider who would never come home. The white path offers different gifts, Elena said, as if reading his thoughts. Your healing will be substantial but incomplete. You will walk without pain, ride without limitation, but you will always carry the knowledge of what you experienced here. You will be forever changed, forever marked as one who has crossed between worlds. Some will see this as a blessing, others as a curse. Joseph Crowfeather stepped forward, adding his voice to the ceremony. Both paths require sacrifice, my son. The Apache path requires you to sacrifice your past and the woman who waits for you. The white path requires you to sacrifice the complete belonging you have found here, the family that has claimed you as their own. Steele closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on him like another fallen tree. But this time, the weight was not physical. It was the accumulated longing of 32 years spent searching for a place to belong, a purpose that justified the pain he'd endured, a love that could survive the worst truths about who he really was. Around the circle, the villagers began a low chant that seemed to emerge from the earth itself, voices joining in harmony that transcended individual identity. Steele could feel their collective energy flowing toward him, offering strength for whatever choice he made while making it clear that both paths led to honor if walked with courage and commitment. Elena's hands descended to his spine, and Steele felt a jolt of energy that was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. It was as if lightning were running through his bones, reconnecting pathways that had been severed, awakening nerves that had forgotten their function. The sensation was simultaneously painful and euphoric, destruction and creation happening in the same moment. I see your heart, Marcus Thompson, Alina said, her voice now carrying the otherworldly tone of deep spiritual trance. I see the love that drove you across 1,000 miles of desert, the guilt that transformed into wisdom, the courage that grew from brokenness. And I see the choice your spirit has already made, even if your mind has not yet acknowledged it. The medicine woman's words penetrated Steele's consciousness like arrows finding their mark. She was right somewhere beneath his conscious deliberation. His heart had already chosen its path. The realization was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. Tell me, Steele whispered, his voice barely audible above the chanting. Tell me what my spirit has chosen. Alina smiled, her weathered face reflecting years of guiding souls through similar crossroads. Your spirit chooses love over fear, connection over isolation, trust over the safety of solitude. But which love, which connection, which trust, that choice remains for your conscious mind to make and your mouth to speak. The ceremony reached its crescendo as Elena's healing energy flowed through Steele's body with increasing intensity. He could feel his spine straightening, damaged nerves reawakening, strength returning to muscles that had forgotten their purpose. But alongside the physical healing, he experienced a deeper transformation, the dissolution of the walls he'd built around his heart during 7 years of self-imposed exile. "I choose," Steele began, then stopped, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was about to say. The entire village waited in absolute silence, their collective breath held as one. Man's decision prepared to ripple outward in ways that would affect every life present. Children who had learned to love the broken cowboy, warriors who had accepted him as brother, elders who had invested their wisdom in his healing, all waited to learn whether their faith in him had been justified or betrayed. "I choose both," Steele said finally, his voice growing stronger as the words emerged. "I choose to be healed completely, but not at the cost of abandoning the woman who waited 7 years for me to find my way home. I choose to honor the Apache family that saved my life, but not by pretending that my heart doesn't belong to someone else." Elena's hands stilled on his spine, surprise flickering across her features. "Explain your meaning, Marcus Thompson." "The spirits offer 2 paths, not a third way that serves your convenience." Steele struggled to sit up, amazed to discover that he could move without pain for the first time in months. The healing was already taking effect, but he sensed that its completion depended on his ability to articulate a choice that satisfied both the spiritual requirements of the ceremony and the honest demands of his heart. "In the white world, I was broken by isolation," Steele said, addressing not just Elena, but the entire assembled community. "I believed that love meant possession, that belonging meant abandoning all other connections. But you've taught me a different way. Apache families stretch across great distances, include people by choice rather than blood, create bonds that survive separation and change." Joseph Crowfeather nodded slowly, beginning to understand Steele's meaning. "You speak of becoming Apache not by abandoning your white life, but by carrying Apache wisdom into that life." "Exactly," Steele confirmed, his voice ringing with conviction. "I want to return to Kansas as an Apache son who happens to live among white people. I want to marry Martha Morrison as a man who carries the teachings of Elena Many Horses and Joseph Crowfeather in his heart. I want to build a life that honors both the woman who waited and the family that healed me." The proposal was unprecedented in the village's experience, but Elena found herself nodding with growing approval. "You would remain connected to us always? Return when you can, send word of your welfare, remember the obligations that bind Apache families together?" "For the rest of my life," Steele promised solemnly. "And if Martha will have me, our children will know their Apache grandparents, will learn the healing ways alongside the white ways, will understand that love multiplies when shared rather than diminished." Elena exchanged glances with Joseph, communication passing between them in the wordless way of people who had worked together for decades. Finally, the medicine woman smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had guided a soul to its proper destination. "The spirits accept your choice, Marcus Thompson," she announced, her hands resuming their healing work with renewed intensity. "You will be healed completely, but you will carry the mark of both worlds always. Your Apache name will be Bridge Walker, one who connects separate peoples without betraying either." As Elena spoke the words of complete healing, Steele felt the last barriers in his spine dissolve like ice in spring sunshine. Strength flowed through his body with a force that brought tears to his eyes, not from pain but from the overwhelming gratitude of a man who had been given back his life, but more than physical wholeness. He felt the integration of everything he'd learned during his time with the Apache people. The courage to stay when staying was hard, the wisdom to love without possessing, the strength to be vulnerable, and the understanding that true healing required community rather than solitude. The ceremony concluded with the entire village embracing Steele as their son, their brother, their family member who would carry their love into the distant world beyond the hidden valley. It was not goodbye. Apache families didn't practice goodbye. When it came to true connections, It was the beginning of a new kind of relationship that would prove that love could indeed bridge any distance when built on foundations of truth, sacrifice, and mutual respect. The morning Steele Thompson prepared to leave the Apache village dawned clear and crisp, with autumn painting the desert mountains in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to bless his journey ahead. For the first time in 5 months, he saddled Ranger without assistance, his fully healed spine allowing him to move with the fluid grace that had once been his trademark. But the man who mounted his paint horse bore little resemblance to the guilt-ridden drifter who had collapsed in the canyon months earlier. Steele's eyes held a depth of wisdom that came from surviving death and choosing life. His posture carried the quiet confidence of someone who had found his place in the world, and his heart bore the expansion that came from loving multiple families. Without betraying any of them, the entire village gathered to see him off, a send-off unprecedented in their experience. Apache culture typically marked departures with understated dignity, but Steele's unique position as bridge walker, one who would carry their wisdom into the white world while remaining forever connected to their community, called for special recognition. Elena Many Horses approached first, carrying a leather pouch that contained carefully prepared medicines and a collection of sacred items that would maintain his spiritual connection to the healing ways he'd learned. "These herbs will serve you in the white world," she explained, pressing the pouch into his hands. "But more important than medicine is what you carry in your heart. Remember that healing is not something you do alone. It requires community, patience, and the courage to stay when staying becomes difficult." Joseph Crow Feather stepped forward next, offering a beautifully crafted silver and turquoise bracelet that bore symbols marking Steele's adoption into the tribe. "This will identify you to any Apache people you encounter," the shaman explained. "But it will also remind you daily of the obligations that bind us together across any distance." The weight of the bracelet on Steele's wrist felt both foreign and familiar, a tangible connection to the family he was leaving behind, but would never truly abandon. He had spent hours learning the stories behind each symbol, understanding that wearing Apache jewelry in the white world would mark him as different, potentially dangerous in the eyes of those who saw Native Americans only as enemies. Ayanna approached last, her recovered grace and strength, a testament to the healing they had both undergone in this sacred place. She carried a bundle wrapped in soft doeskin that she placed carefully in Steele's saddlebags. "Letters," she explained with a smile that mixed sadness with hope, "from everyone in the village who wanted to send words to your white family. And a photograph that Joseph's friend in Globe helped us arrange. So the woman who waits will know the faces of the people who love you here." The gesture moved Steele more deeply than any elaborate ceremony could have. The idea that his Apache family wanted to communicate with Martha, to be included in his white life rather than competing with it, demonstrated the profound wisdom that had guided his healing from the beginning. "I'll come back," Steele promised, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "This isn't goodbye because Apache families don't practice goodbye. I'll return when I can, and Martha will come with me if she's willing. You'll always be part of my life, part of any family I build." Running Wolf stepped forward, offering his hand in the white man's gesture of farewell while speaking in Apache. "May your horses always find water, may your enemies always miss their aim, and may your heart always remember the path home to those who love you." As Steele guided Ranger out of the hidden valley, he carried with him more than just personal belongings and healing medicines. He bore the hopes and dreams of an entire community, their faith that one man could successfully bridge two worlds that had been at war for generations. The journey to Kansas would take 6 weeks if traveled steadily, but Steele had no intention of rushing toward his destination. His time with the Apache had taught him that meaningful journeys required contemplation as well as motion, that the path between destinations often proved as important as the destinations themselves. His first stop came after 3 days of steady travel, at a small trading post outside Tucson where news from the outside world awaited. The proprietor, a grizzled former cavalry scout named Pete Harrison, recognized Steele immediately despite the dramatic changes in his appearance. "Well, I'll be damned," Pete exclaimed as Steele dismounted. "Marcus Thompson, back from the dead. Heard tell you'd been killed by Apaches up in the Superstitions. Some prospector claimed he found pieces of your gear scattered around a canyon like you'd been torn apart." The story explained why no one had come looking for him during his recovery. Steele realized that his disappearance had been attributed to Indian violence, making his survival all the more remarkable in the eyes of those who knew the territory's dangers. "Not killed," Steele replied carefully. "Just delayed by circumstances beyond my control. I'm headed back to Kansas now, figuring it's time to stop wandering and settle down." Pete studied Steele's face with the sharp eye of someone accustomed to reading character in dangerous country. "You look different, Marcus. Healthier somehow, but also, I don't know, like you've seen things that changed you deep down." The observation was more accurate than Pete could have known. Steele had indeed seen things, witnessed healing practices that white medicine couldn't explain, experienced community bonds that transcended individual interest, discovered love that multiplied rather than divided when shared across cultural boundaries. "A man can't travel far without being changed by what he encounters," Steele replied diplomatically. "The question is whether the changes make him better or worse." "In your case, I'd say better," Pete assessed. "You always carried yourself like a man running from something. Now you move like someone heading towards something worthwhile." The conversation reminded Steele of how carefully he would need to navigate his return to white society. The wisdom and practices he'd learned from the Apache could benefit many people, but sharing them openly would invite suspicion, hostility, and potentially violence from those who viewed Native Americans as subhuman savages rather than people. With valuable knowledge, his second significant stop came 2 weeks later in Santa Fe, where he visited a photographer's studio to have formal portraits made for Martha and his Apache family. The daguerreotypes would serve as proof of his survival and transformation, visual evidence of the bridge walker he had become. The photographer, a refined gentleman from Boston named William Hartwell, was fascinated by Steele's unique appearance. Combination of traditional cowboy attire with Apache jewelry and the unmistakable bearing of someone who had experienced profound spiritual transformation. "Forgive my curiosity," Hartwell said as he prepared his equipment, "but you have the look of a man with an extraordinary story. The silver work on that bracelet is exquisite, clearly Apache craftsmanship of the highest quality. Such pieces are rarely seen outside tribal communities." Steele chose his words carefully, understanding that his story would eventually spread through Santa Fe's social circles. "I had occasion to spend time among Apache people during my recovery from an injury. They treated me with kindness I hadn't expected to find." "Recovery?" Hartwell probed gently. "If you don't mind my asking, what kind of injury requires months of treatment in Indian territory?" "Broken back," Steele replied simply. "Hurt myself lifting a tree off someone who was trapped." The Apache knew healing methods that white doctors couldn't provide. The photographer's eyes widened with professional interest. "A broken back, healed by Indian medicine? My word, that's remarkable. Such methods could revolutionize medical practice if properly documented and studied." Steele felt a flicker of excitement at the possibility. Perhaps his role as bridge walker could extend beyond maintaining personal connections to his Apache family. Maybe he could help introduce Apache healing knowledge to white medical practitioners in ways that honored both traditions. "Would you be interested in learning more about such methods?" Steele asked carefully. "If I could arrange proper introductions, conducted with respect for Apache customs and knowledge?" Hartwell's enthusiasm was immediate and genuine. "Absolutely. The medical community is desperately in need of new approaches to spinal injuries and other conditions that conventional treatment can't address. if you could facilitate such exchanges. The conversation planted seeds of possibility that would grow throughout Steele's remaining journey. He began to envision ways that his unique position could benefit both communities, introducing Apache healing wisdom to white doctors who could help more patients, while providing his Apache family with access to resources and recognition that could improve their own circumstances. As he traveled through Colorado and into Kansas, Steele found himself stopping frequently to help others in need. His enhanced strength and Apache-learned healing skills proved valuable to fellow travelers suffering from injuries or illnesses that conventional remedies couldn't address. Near Denver, he helped a family whose child had been trampled by horses, using Elena's teachings to treat internal injuries that a local doctor had declared hopeless. The child's recovery was so remarkable that word spread throughout the territorial medical community, establishing Steele's reputation as someone with extraordinary healing abilities. Outside Topeka, he encountered a cavalry patrol whose scout had been shot by hostile Cheyenne warriors. Steele's knowledge of Apache medicine and his ability to communicate basic concepts in native languages helped negotiate a temporary ceasefire that prevented escalation into larger conflict. Each intervention reinforced his understanding of his unique role as bridge walker. He was becoming exactly what Joseph Crow Feather had envisioned, a man who could move between worlds, carrying the best of each culture to benefit both communities while betraying neither. But the closer he came to Kansas, the more his thoughts focused on Martha Morrison and the life they might build together. His saddlebags now contained letters from the Apache village, photographs that would introduce his white family to his native family, and plans for integrating both traditions into a single household. The biggest question remaining was whether Martha would embrace his transformation or find herself unable to accept the man he had become. 7 years was a long time to wait for someone who might return fundamentally changed by experiences she couldn't fully understand. As the familiar landscape of Kansas spread before him like a green sea of possibilities, Steele Thompson Bridge Walker of the Apache prepared to discover whether love truly could survive any transformation when built on foundations of truth, patience, and mutual respect. The final test of his healing was about to begin, not in a sacred ceremony surrounded by chanting voices, but in a simple farmhouse where a woman had kept faith with a dream for 7 long years. The success or failure of his journey would be measured not in miles traveled or obstacles overcome, but in whether two hearts could find their way back to each other across the vast distances that time and experience had created between them. Morrison Farmhouse looked exactly as Steele remembered it, white clapboard siding weathered by Kansas storms, green shutters that Martha's mother had painted the year before the cholera outbreak, and the wide front porch where he'd shared countless evening conversations with the woman who'd waited 7 years for his return. But approaching the familiar property on a crisp November morning, Steele felt like a stranger observing someone else's memories. The man who had left this place in shame and self-hatred bore little resemblance to the bridge walker who now guided Ranger down the tree-lined lane, his Apache bracelet catching sunlight and his medicine pouch resting securely in his saddlebags. He reined in at the edge of the property, sudden uncertainty gripping his chest. What if Martha had changed her mind during the months since their correspondence began? What if the reality of his transformation proved too foreign for her to accept? What if 7 years of idealized memory had created expectations that neither of them could fulfill? The front door opened before he could resolve his doubts, and Martha Morrison stepped onto the porch with the same grace that had captured his heart a decade earlier. But like himself, she had been changed by time and experience. Her honey-colored hair was now pinned in a more mature style. Her figure had gained the fuller curves of a woman rather than a girl, and her blue eyes held depths that spoke of patience tested and wisdom earned through waiting. "Marcus Thompson," she said, her voice carrying across the morning air with a mixture of joy, relief, and something deeper that he couldn't quite identify. "Welcome home." The simple words broke through his hesitation like sunrise through storm. "Clouds." Steele dismounted and walked toward the porch, each step feeling like a return to himself, as much as a return to this place. When he reached the bottom step, Martha descended to meet him, and they stood facing each other in the morning light, two people who had loved, lost, and waited long enough to discover whether their love could survive the ultimate test of time and transformation. "You look ... Martha began, then stopped, her eyes taking in the changes that marked his journey. The silver bracelet, the subtle alterations in his posture and bearing, the depth in his gray eyes that spoke of experiences beyond anything she could imagine. "Different," Steele finished for her. "I know. The man who left here isn't the man who came back. The question is whether that's a change you can accept." Martha studied his face with the careful attention of someone making a crucial assessment. "The man who left here was broken by guilt and running from shadows that existed mostly in his own mind. The man standing before me looks like someone who's found peace with himself and purpose in his life. Why would I want the broken version when I can have the healed one?" Her acceptance was more complete than Steele had dared hope, but he knew that the real test would come when she learned the full extent of his transformation. "Martha, there are things about where I've been and what I've experienced that you need to understand before we go any further. Changes that go deeper than what you can see on the surface." "Then come inside," Martha said, taking his arm with the natural ease of someone who had never stopped loving him. "We have 7 years of catching up to do, and I want to hear everything." The interior of the farmhouse enveloped Steele in waves of memory and emotion. The kitchen where he'd shared countless meals with Martha's family, the parlor where they'd read together on winter evenings, the staircase where he'd stolen his first kiss from the woman who would define his understanding of love. Everything was exactly as he remembered. Yet somehow smaller than his memory had preserved that Martha busied herself preparing coffee while Steele sat at the familiar kitchen table, his hands tracing patterns in the wood grain while he searched for words to explain the impossible. How could he describe the Apache village, the healing ceremonies, the spiritual transformation that had remade him from the inside out? How could he convey the depth of his connection to people she'd never met, obligations that would influence every decision for the rest of his life? "Start with the injury," Martha suggested, setting a steaming cup before him and settling into the chair across the table. "Your letters mention that you broke your back saving someone, but not the details." Steele began with the canyon, the fallen tree, the young Apache woman whose life had hung in the balance. Martha listened without interruption as he described the decision to lift impossible weight, the moment of breaking, the realization that his sacrifice had cost him the use of his legs. "And this woman Ayanna, she was worth risking permanent paralysis?" Martha asked, her tone carefully neutral. "Any innocent person would have been worth that risk," Steele replied honestly. "But yes, she was special, is special. She's like a sister to me now, part of the family that saved my life when they had every reason to let me die." Martha's slight stiffening at the word family didn't escape Steele's notice. This was the crucial moment, the point where his dual loyalties would either be accepted or rejected by the woman whose opinion mattered most. "Tell me about this family," Martha said, her voice betraying only the slightest tension. "The people who healed you when white doctors couldn't." Steele pulled the bundle of letters and photographs from his travel bag, spreading them across the kitchen table like evidence in a trial where his future happiness hung in the balance. "Their names are Joseph Crowfeather and Elena Many Horses. They're Apache, and they saved my life using methods that most white people would call impossible." Martha studied the photographs with the intense concentration of someone examining artifacts from another world. Joseph's dignified bearing, Elena's wise eyes, Ayanna's young beauty, Running Wolf's warrior strength, all captured in daguerreotypes that revealed the humanity behind cultural stereotypes. "They're beautiful," Martha said finally, surprising Steele with the genuineness of her reaction. And they clearly care about you deeply. This woman, Elena, she has the look of someone who could heal anything, given enough time and wisdom. She did. Steele touched his spine reflexively, still amazed by the completeness of his recovery. But Martha, you need to understand that healing among the Apache isn't just medical. It's spiritual, ceremonial, binding. They didn't just fix my back, they adopted me into their tribe. I have a new name among them, Bridge Walker. I have obligations, connections, relationships that will influence the rest of my life. Martha set down the photographs and looked directly into Steele's eyes. Are you asking my permission to maintain these connections? Or are you telling me that they're non-negotiable parts of who you are now? The directness of her question cut straight to the heart of his fears. I'm asking whether you can love a man who belongs to two worlds instead of just one. Whether you can accept that our marriage, if we have one, will include people and traditions that most of your neighbors will find strange or threatening. Martha was quiet for a long moment, her blue eyes searching his face for something only she could identify. When she spoke, her voice carried the conviction of someone who had spent 7 years thinking about exactly this kind of challenge. Marcus Thompson, I waited 7 years for you to come home, not because I was afraid of being alone, but because I believed you were worth waiting for. The man I fell in love with was someone who would risk everything to protect innocent people, even when it cost him dearly. The man sitting across from me now has clearly paid that price and found healing in the most unlikely place. She reached across the table to take his hands, her fingers tracing this silver bracelet that marked his Apache identity. If your healing came from Apache wisdom, then I honor that wisdom. If your family now includes people who saved your life, then they're welcome in any home we build together. And if you've learned things that could help others heal, then we have an obligation to share those gifts with anyone who needs them. Steele felt tears prick his eyes at her complete acceptance. It won't be easy, Martha. Some people in this community won't understand. They'll see the Apache connections as dangerous, the healing methods as heathen practices. We could face real hostility. Then we'll face it together, Martha replied firmly. I've had 7 years to learn that love isn't about finding someone who fits perfectly into your existing life. It's about being willing to build a new life that honors both people's truths. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Through the kitchen window, Steele saw 3 riders dismounting near the front porch, 2 men in suits and badges that identified them as federal marshals, accompanied by a third man whose expensive clothes and authoritative bearing suggested government authority. Mrs. Morrison, one of the marshals, called from the porch. We'd like to speak with you about reports that Marcus Thompson has returned to the area. We understand he may have been in contact with hostile Apache elements. Steele and Martha exchanged glances, understanding immediately that his presence had already been reported by someone who viewed his Apache connections as potentially treasonous. The real test of their reunion was about to begin, not in the privacy of the kitchen, but under the scrutiny of federal authorities who had the power to arrest him for collaboration with enemy forces. What do we do? Martha whispered, her hand tightening on Steele's. We tell the truth, Steele replied, standing to face whatever consequences awaited. And we trust that love and honesty are stronger than fear and prejudice. As the marshal's knocking grew more insistent, Steele Thompson Bridge Walker of the Apache prepared to defend not just his own freedom, but the possibility that two cultures could find common ground through the love of one white woman and one transformed cowboy who refused to choose between the worlds that had both claimed him. The kitchen that had witnessed his happiest memories was about to become the courtroom where his future would be decided. And Martha Morrison was about to discover whether her faith in love's power to overcome any obstacle was justified by reality or merely the romantic dream of a woman who had waited too long for a man who could never truly come home. Outside, the marshals continued their demands for entry, while inside, Two people who had found each other again, prepared to fight for the right, to build a life that honored both their love and the complicated truths that had shaped them during 7 years of separation. Martha Morrison opened the front door with the composed dignity of a woman who had spent 7 years learning that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to face whatever came with grace and determination. The 3 federal officials on her porch represented everything that could destroy the happiness she'd just rediscovered, but she met their scrutiny with steady blue eyes that revealed no hint of intimidation. "Gentlemen," Martha said formally, "how may I help you?" Marshal Henry Davidson, no relation to the Frank Davidson who had orchestrated the bank robbery years earlier, stepped forward with the authoritative bearing of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. A tall, lean man in his 40s, Davidson carried himself with the rigid posture of career military, his gray eyes reflecting the cold calculation of someone who viewed the world in terms of threats to be neutralized. "Mrs. Morrison, I'm Marshal Davidson, and this is Marshal Collins and Territorial Agent Reynolds. We have credible reports that Marcus Thompson has returned to this area after spending months among hostile Apache forces. We need to speak with him immediately regarding potential violations of federal law." Steele appeared in the doorway behind Martha, his imposing frame filling the space as he placed a protective hand on her shoulder. The sight of him caused all 3 officials to tense visibly. His Apache bracelet caught the morning light like a declaration of allegiance, and his bearing carried the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to navigate dangerous situations without backing down. "I'm Marcus Thompson," Steele said simply, "and I understand you have questions about my recent experiences." Marshal Davidson's eyes fixed on the silver bracelet with obvious suspicion. "Mr. Thompson, federal law requires civilians to report any contact with hostile Indian forces to territorial authorities within 30 days. You've been missing for over 5 months, during which time several Apache bands have conducted raids against white settlements. We need to understand the nature of your contact with these groups." Steele stepped fully onto the porch, subtly positioning himself between Martha and the federal officials. "I'm happy to answer your questions, Marshal Davidson, but I should clarify that my contact was with peaceful Apache people who saved my life when I was injured. They're not affiliated with any hostile bands, and they pose no threat to white settlements." Agent Reynolds, a younger man with the intense eyes of someone convinced that conspiracy lurked behind every unexplained circumstance, pulled out a leather notebook and began recording Steele's words. "Mr. Thompson, how exactly did you come to be in contact with these Apache people? Our reports suggest you disappeared from the Tucson area following what appeared to be an attack." "I was injured lifting a fallen tree off a trapped Apache woman," Steele explained carefully. "Her family brought me to their village for medical treatment. When it became clear that my injuries were beyond conventional healing, they saved my life using traditional medicine." "Traditional medicine," Marshal Collins repeated skeptically. "You're asking us to believe that Indian folk remedies healed injuries serious enough to incapacitate you for months?" Steele met the marshal's skeptical gaze steadily. "I'm telling you that Apache healing methods successfully treated a broken back that would have left me permanently paralyzed under white medical care. I can provide documentation from physicians who examined me before and after treatment, if you require proof." The offer of medical documentation seemed to give the officials pause. Agent Reynolds continued his note-taking while Marshal Davidson studied Steele with renewed interest. "Mr. Thompson, during your time with these Apache people, did you observe any evidence of hostile intentions toward white settlements? Weapons stockpiles, war planning, communication with known hostile bands?" "None whatsoever," Steele replied firmly. "The community that helped me is focused on maintaining their traditional way of life while avoiding conflict with white authorities. They're peaceful people who want nothing more than to be left alone to practice their customs and care for their families." Martha stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority of someone speaking from deep conviction. "Gentlemen, I've known Marcus Thompson for over a decade. He's a man of unquestioned integrity who has repeatedly risked his life to protect innocent people. If he says these Apache people are peaceful, then they are peaceful." Marshal Davidson's expression softened slightly at Martha's intervention, but his duty remained clear. "Mrs. Morrison, I appreciate your faith in Mr. Thompson's character. However, federal law requires us to investigate any civilian contact with Indian forces, regardless of the circumstances or the civilian's reputation." Agent Reynolds looked up from his notebook with obvious excitement. "Mr. Thompson, you mentioned that you were treated using traditional Apache medicine. Did you learn any of these methods yourself? Do you possess knowledge of Indian practices that could be considered sensitive information?" The question struck at the heart of Steele's dilemma. His knowledge of Apache healing methods could indeed be considered sensitive information by federal authorities who viewed all Indian knowledge as potentially dangerous. But that same knowledge represented the possibility of helping countless people who suffered from conditions that conventional medicine couldn't address. "I learned some basic healing techniques," Steele admitted carefully. "Methods that could benefit many people if properly shared and adapted. But I would never use such knowledge in ways that could harm the people who taught me or endanger their community." Martha sensed the dangerous direction of the questioning and decided to take a calculated risk. "Marshal Davidson, perhaps you'd be interested to know that Marcus has already used his Apache healing knowledge to help several people during his journey home, including a cavalry scout who was shot by hostile Cheyenne near Denver." The revelation had exactly the effect Martha intended. Agent Reynolds' pen stilled in his notebook, while Marshal Davidson's eyebrows rose with interest. The idea that Steele's Apache knowledge had been used to help cavalry personnel cast his experiences in an entirely different light. "You treated a cavalry scout?" Marshal Collins asked with obvious interest. "What was the nature of his injuries, and how successful was the treatment?" Steele recognized Martha's strategic brilliance in shifting the conversation toward his helpful actions rather than his potentially suspicious connections. "Bullet wound to the shoulder with infection that Whitefield medicine couldn't control. I used Apache herbal treatments and wound care techniques to prevent gangrene and promote healing. The scout made a complete recovery." "And the cavalry officers involved?" Agent Reynolds asked eagerly. "Would they be willing to provide testimony regarding your assistance and character?" "I believe so," Steele replied. Captain William Morrison of the 3rd Colorado Cavalry witnessed the entire treatment and expressed great interest in learning more about Apache medical methods. The irony of the captain's surname Morrison, the same as Martha's family, was not lost on anyone present, though no one commented on it directly. Marshal Davidson exchanged glances with his colleagues, clearly reassessing their initial assumptions about Steele's activities and loyalties. "Mr. Thompson," Marshal Davidson said slowly, "these Apache people who helped you, would they be willing to share their medical knowledge with Army physicians? We have many soldiers suffering from injuries that conventional treatment can't address." Steele felt the weight of his Bridgewalker identity settling on his shoulders. This was exactly the kind of cultural exchange that Joseph Crow Feather had envisioned, but it would require careful negotiation to ensure that Apache knowledge was respected rather than exploited. "That would depend on the circumstances," Steele replied diplomatically. "Apache healing traditions are sacred to them, not merely medical techniques. Any sharing of knowledge would need to be conducted with proper respect for their customs and fair compensation for their expertise." Agent Reynolds looked up from his notes with obvious frustration. "Mr. Thompson, you seem to be placing the interests of Indian people above those of the United States government. That could be construed as divided loyalty, which is a serious matter in these times of frontier conflict." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Steele felt Martha's hand find his. her touch providing strength for the response that would define his future relationship with federal authority. "Agent Reynolds," Steele said with quiet intensity, "my loyalty to the United States is unquestioned. But my gratitude to the people who saved my life is also unquestioned. I believe that true patriotism means working to reduce conflict between cultures rather than promoting it. If Apache healing knowledge can help American soldiers, then sharing that knowledge serves both communities." Marshal Davidson nodded slowly, recognizing wisdom in Steele's words. "Mr. Thompson, I'm going to make you an offer. The territorial government is interested in establishing better relationships with peaceful Indian communities, particularly if such relationships could lead to medical innovations that benefit our military personnel." The Marshal paused, choosing his words carefully. "Would you be willing to serve as a liaison between these Apache people and territorial authorities, to facilitate communication and potential collaboration while ensuring that both sides' interests are protected?" Steele felt his pulse quicken with excitement. The offer represented exactly the kind of bridge-building opportunity that could justify his unique position between two worlds. But it also carried risks that could endanger his Apache family if not handled with extreme care. "I would need certain guarantees," Steele said slowly. "Protection for the Apache community from military action, respect for their customs and autonomy, and fair treatment in any agreements or exchanges." "Those terms seem reasonable," Marshal Davidson replied. "But we would also need guarantees from you, regular reports on Apache activities, immediate notification of any hostile intentions you might observe, and cooperation with territorial authorities in matters of frontier security." Martha squeezed Steele's hand, understanding the magnitude of the decision he faced. Accepting the federal offer would legitimize his relationship with the Apache people while providing opportunities to help both communities, but it would also place him under constant scrutiny and require him to balance loyalties that might sometimes conflict. "I'll need time to consider your offer," Steele said finally. "And I'll need to discuss it with the Apache people involved. They must agree to any arrangement before I can commit to serving as liaison." Agent Reynolds closed his notebook with obvious satisfaction. "Mr. Thompson, we'll expect your answer within 2 weeks. In the meantime, you're not to leave the territorial boundaries without federal permission, and you must report any contact with Indian persons to our office within 24 hours. As the federal officials prepared to depart, Marshal Davidson turned back with one final question. "Mr. Thompson, one last thing. This Apache woman whose life you saved, Ayanna, I believe you mentioned, what is her relationship to her tribal leadership?" Steele felt a chill of premonition at the question. "She's the daughter of Joseph Crow Feather, one of the community's spiritual leaders. Why do you ask?" Marshal Davidson exchanged a meaningful glance with Agent Reynolds before answering. "Because our intelligence suggests that Joseph Crow Feather is one of the most influential Apache leaders in the territory. If you've gained his trust and approval, that makes you potentially very valuable to territorial peace efforts." As the federal officials rode away, Steele and Martha stood on the porch watching dust clouds mark their retreat. The morning's conversation had transformed Steele from a suspected collaborator into a potential government asset, but the change brought new responsibilities and dangers that would affect every aspect of their future together. "Well," Martha said with a slight smile, "I don't think either of us expected your homecoming to involve federal recruitment." Steele pulled her closer, drawing strength from her presence as he contemplated the impossible complexity of his situation. "Martha, if I accept their offer, our life together will be unlike anything you've imagined. We'll be constantly watched, questioned, evaluated, and we'll be responsible for decisions that could affect the lives of hundreds of people on both sides." Martha looked up at him with eyes that held no trace of fear, only determination. "Marcus Thompson, I didn't wait 7 years for you to come home just so you could choose the safe path. If this is your calling, if this is how you can serve both your families, then we'll face whatever comes together. As they stood embracing on the porch where their love had first bloomed a decade earlier, Steele Thompson realized that his transformation from guilt-ridden drifter to bridge walker was far from complete. The most challenging part of his journey was just beginning, learning to serve two peoples, while building a marriage that could survive the constant tension of divided loyalties and federal scrutiny. 3 years after Steele Thompson accepted the federal government's offer to serve as Apache liaison, the former drifter stood before the largest gathering of territorial officials, military officers, and Apache leaders ever assembled in the Arizona Territory. The meeting was taking place in a neutral location, a natural amphitheater in the Dragoon Mountains where Cochise himself had once held council, chosen specifically to honor both cultures involved in these unprecedented negotiations. Steele, now officially designated as cultural liaison and medical coordinator by the territorial government, wore a unique combination of formal territorial dress and Apache ceremonial items that symbolized his role as bridge walker. His silver bracelet caught the morning sunlight, while the eagle feather gifted by Joseph Crow feather adorned the band of his dress had visual reminders that his loyalty belonged not to any single authority, but to the cause of peace and mutual understanding. Martha Thompson sat in the front row of observers, her presence a testament to how completely she had embraced her husband's dual world. Over the past 3 years, she had become as respected in Apache communities as Steele was in territorial circles, her natural compassion and quick intelligence making her an invaluable partner in his bridge-building efforts. Their marriage had not only survived the constant scrutiny and complex demands of Steele's position, it had thrived, strengthened by shared purpose and mutual respect. Ladies and gentlemen, Apache leaders and territorial representatives, Steele began, his voice carrying easily across the gathered assembly. 3 years ago, many of you believed that meaningful cooperation between white and Apache peoples was impossible. Today, we gather to celebrate proof that such cooperation not only works, but benefits everyone involved. The transformation in relationships had been gradual but profound. What began with Steele's simple offer to share Apache healing knowledge had evolved into a comprehensive program that revolutionized medical care throughout the territory while providing Apache communities with resources and recognition that protected them from hostile government policies. Dr. William Hartwell, the photographer Steele had met in Santa Fe, who had become the territorial coordinator for the Apache Medical Exchange Program, rose to present the initiative's remarkable results. In 3 years of collaboration, Dr. Hartwell announced, Apache healing methods have reduced battlefield mortality rates by 40%, eliminated infections that conventional medicine couldn't treat, and provided breakthrough treatments for spinal injuries, internal trauma, and chronic pain conditions. Alina Many Horses, now recognized as the territory's foremost expert in traditional medicine, sat beside Joseph Crow Feather among the Apache delegation. At 73, the medicine woman had found new purpose in teaching selected white physicians the healing arts she had mastered over decades of practice. Her students included some of the most respected doctors in the territory, men who had overcome initial skepticism to embrace knowledge that saved lives conventional medicine couldn't reach. The financial benefits have been equally significant. Continued Territorial Treasurer James Morrison, Martha's cousin, who had become one of Steele's strongest supporters in government circles. Apache communities participating in the medical exchange program have received over $50,000 in compensation for their knowledge and services, providing economic stability that has eliminated the desperation that often led to raids and conflicts. But the most remarkable achievement of the Bridge Walker Initiative wasn't measured in dollars or medical statistics. It was visible in the children who played together in integrated settlements, the Apache scouts who worked alongside cavalry patrols to protect both communities from genuinely hostile bands, and the marriages that had begun to bridge cultural divides throughout the territory. Ayanna Crowfeather, now 23 and one of the first Apache women to receive formal education in both traditional and white knowledge systems, stood to address the assembly in her capacity as cultural education coordinator. 3 years ago, my father saved the life of a broken cowboy who lifted a tree off my body, she said, her English flawless but retaining the musical cadences of her native tongue. Today, that cowboy has shown our people and yours that healing comes not from choosing sides, but from building bridges strong enough to support both cultures. The audience, a mixture of military officers, territorial officials, Apache leaders, and settlers from throughout the region, responded with applause. That would have been unthinkable 3 years earlier. Men who had once viewed each other as mortal enemies now worked together to solve problems that affected both communities. General Nelson Miles, the territorial military commander whose initial skepticism had gradually transformed into grudging respect and finally genuine enthusiasm, rose to address the gathering. When Marshal Davidson first proposed using Mr. Thompson as an Apache liaison, I considered it a desperate measure with little chance of success. I am pleased to report that I was completely wrong. General Miles gestured toward a display of photographs documenting the program's achievements. Apache healers working alongside Army surgeons, integrated cavalry patrols maintaining peace across territorial boundaries, children from both cultures learning together in schools that honored multiple knowledge traditions. The Apache Medical Exchange Program has not only improved our military readiness, General Miles continued, it has demonstrated that cooperation serves our national interests far better than conflict. I am recommending to Washington that this model be expanded to other territories facing similar challenges. But the day's most significant moment came when Joseph Crow Feather stood to deliver what everyone knew would be his final public address. The elderly shaman had been diagnosed with a heart condition that Apache and white medicine alike could slow but not cure, making this gathering his farewell to the bridge-building work he had inspired and guided. My friends from both peoples, Joseph began, his voice carrying the wisdom of 7 decades and the authority of someone who had guided his community through its most challenging period. When my daughter lay trapped beneath the fallen tree, I could not have imagined that her rescue would lead to this moment. The shaman's eyes found steel in the crowd, and the two men exchanged a look of mutual respect and affection that transcended all cultural boundaries. Bridge Walker has shown us that healing comes not from forgetting our differences, but from honoring them while building connections that serve everyone's welfare. He has proved that love for family, love for community, love for justice can overcome any obstacle when guided by wisdom and strengthened by courage. Joseph Crow Feather paused, his weathered hands reaching into a leather pouch to withdraw a small object that gleamed in the morning sunlight. 3 years ago, I gave Bridge Walker a silver bracelet to mark his adoption into our tribe. Today, I present him with something far more precious, the sacred buffalo horn that has been carried by Apache peace chiefs for 10 generations. The assembled crowd fell silent as they grasped the magnitude of the honor being bestowed. The buffalo horn was legendary among Apache people, carried only by leaders whose wisdom and courage had earned them the right to speak for multiple bands in matters of war and peace. Steele approached Joseph with the humble bearing of someone who understood that this moment transcended personal recognition. As the elderly shaman placed the sacred horn in Steele's hands, the symbolism was unmistakable. Leadership in the work of bridge building was passing from the Apache elder who had envisioned it to the white man who had learned to embody it. With this horn comes responsibility, Joseph said, his voice carrying across the silent amphitheater. The responsibility to speak for those who have no voice, to protect those who cannot protect themselves, and to build bridges that will serve generations not yet born. Martha wiped away tears as she watched her husband accept the sacred trust that would define the rest of their lives together. Their marriage had produced 2 children, a son named Joseph Marcus Thompson and a daughter called Elena Martha Thompson, who were being raised to claim both their Apache and white heritage. These children, along with dozens of others throughout the territory, represented the future that Steele and Martha were building through their daily choices and long-term vision. Dr. Hartwell stepped forward to make the final announcement that would cement Steele's legacy as bridge walker. The territorial legislature has approved funding for the Marcus Thompson Institute for Cultural Medicine, he declared, a permanent facility that will train doctors in both traditional and Apache healing methods while providing advanced medical care to all territorial residents regardless of cultural background. The institute, to be built on land donated jointly by the territorial government and Apache communities, would serve as a living monument to the principle that different knowledge systems could strengthen rather than threaten each other when combined with wisdom and respect. As the formal ceremony concluded and the gathering began to disperse, Steele found himself surrounded by people whose lives had been touched by the bridge-building work of the past 3 years. Army officers whose soldiers had been saved by Apache medicine, Apache families whose children now had access to white education and economic opportunities, territorial officials who had discovered that cooperation produced better results than conflict. But the moment that would remain in Steele's memory forever came when a young cavalry private approached him with obvious nervousness and tremendous gratitude. "Mr. Thompson," the soldier said, his voice shaking with emotion, "I wanted to thank you for what you've done. I was shot by Comanche raiders 6 months ago, and the doctors said I'd never walk again. But the Apache healer you trained, she fixed my spine using methods I didn't know existed. I'm getting married next month to a girl who thought she'd lost me forever." Steele clasped the young man's hand, feeling the calluses that marked him as someone who worked with his body as well as his courage. "Private, your healing came from Apache wisdom passed down through generations. The real thanks belong to people like Elena Many Horses, who were willing to share knowledge that could have remained secret." As the sun began to set over the Dragoon Mountains, painting the desert landscape in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to bless the day's achievements, Steele and Martha walked hand in hand toward their camp. Their children ran ahead playing games that combined Apache and white traditions in ways that would have been impossible 3 years earlier. "Do you ever regret it?" Martha asked as they paused to watch their son demonstrate to his sister the proper way to track animals using techniques learned from running wolf. "Do you ever wish you'd taken that original offer from Blackwood Industries and disappeared into Texas like you planned?" Steele pulled his wife closer, his free hand touching the sacred buffalo horn that now hung beside his Apache bracelet, tangible reminders of the journey that had brought him from broken drifter to respected leader. "Martha, 3 years ago, I thought my boots were made for walking away from everything that was difficult or complicated. I thought love meant choosing sides, that healing meant hiding from pain, that belonging required rejecting everyone who was different." He gestured toward the scene before them, Apache and white families sharing evening meals, children playing together regardless of their heritage, adults working together to solve problems that had once seemed insurmountable. "Now I know that my boots were made for standing still long enough to build something worth keeping. They were made for walking toward the people who needed what I could offer, not away from the responsibilities that scared me. And they were made for carrying me into a life where love multiplies instead of divides, where healing includes the whole community, and where bridges prove stronger than walls." Martha smiled as she watched Elena Many Horses teaching their daughter how to identify healing plants while Joseph Crow Feather showed their son the proper way to offer prayers to the 4 directions. "I think your grandfather Pete would be proud of what you've built here, Marcus. This isn't just about healing your back or bridging cultures. It's about proving that broken things can become stronger in the broken places." As the first stars appeared in the desert sky, Steele Thompson, bridge walker of the Apache, husband to Martha, father to children who belonged to both worlds, keeper of the sacred buffalo horn, reflected on the truth that had taken him 35 years to learn. Sometimes the greatest adventures didn't come from riding toward unknown horizons, but from standing firm and building something worthy of the next generation's inheritance. His boots, which had once been made for walking away, had finally found their true purpose, carrying him toward the people and places where love could take root and grow into something that would outlast any individual life, creating bridges strong enough to span any divide when built on foundations of courage, wisdom, and the revolutionary idea that healing was always stronger than harm. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.